Hey there, this is James Darknell from the Foundry, and in this series of videos I'm going to be covering all of the various aspects of the new workflow introduced in MODO 10.2 for Mesh Fusion. In this video, I want to demonstrate the basics of using Mesh Fusion to get you up to speed to the new workflow as quickly as possible. If you've never used Mesh Fusion before, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised to find out how easy it is to make complex objects from simple forms. If you have used Mesh Fusion before, I think you'll be excited to find out how simplified the new workflow is. Let's jump into our toolbox and take a look. So I'm in my modeling workspace here in the modeling tab, and to get to the Fusion tools, they're found right here in the Fusion subtab. So what I'm going to be covering in this video right here are these tools right here. So these are the main creation tools for creating Mesh Fusion objects. Now, I have various geometry that I've already placed in my scene. These are cubics that ship with Mesh Fusion that you can find in the preset browser. And the requirements for Mesh Fusion haven't changed significantly for this version. The models still work best when they're made out of all quads. So you see these are all four-sided polygons in all of this geometry that I have here. But the new algorithms are actually a lot more tolerant of having triangles and n-gons, more than 4 edges. So Mesh Fusion isn't going to be thrown for a loop like it was in previous versions if you happen to have, an n-gon here or there or a triangle somewhere in your object. Alright, so let's get started actually creating a Fusion object. And this is similar to the way things worked before. So I'm going to select my objects here that I want to create in my Fusion object. And my Fusion object is created by clicking this New Fusion button here in the interface. So I'll click that, and that opens as a popover, but I'm going to pin this right here by dragging it into the interface. So like before, we can set a name. We can call that Fuse. And then we have a couple of options here. So the absolute strip width, this is the new improved strip algorithm. So if you're familiar with previous versions of Mesh Fusion, sometimes around tight corners the strips would elongate and it didn't look quite natural. This absolute strip width fixes that and you get nice clean strips around edges. This new schematic workspace, if you are going to be working in schematic, if that's a workflow that you prefer, if you check this box, each new Fusion object that you create will get its own schematic workspace in there. For the most part, you can probably just ignore that. You won't need to go into schematic very often, but if you do like that workflow, obviously this is an option there. And then these are your defaults for your strips that are going to be created. And if you're not familiar with what a strip is, these are the transitions that are generated automatically between the fused meshes, giving it that nice rounded look. So because of the size of my objects here, I can see that this grid is 100 millimeters. I'm going to increase this just to make that a little bit more visible. And then I'm going to leave my profile. That'll give it a nice rounded look at 50%, and the strip smoothness will blend that in nicely to the surrounding meshes. So for the most part, other than the strip width, generally just accept the defaults on that. And of course, we can go back and adjust that after the fact. So now if I create my new Fusion object, you can see it has created a Fusion item over here, and it has started color coding these objects in the items list. So with the new Fusion workflow, there's really 2 considerations you need to take into account. So meshes in a Mesh Fusion object are going to have their roles, and then they're going to have their relationships. So a role effectively is how does it contribute to the Fusion object itself. So a role can be either a primary, which means it's an additive mesh, or it's a trim, which can be either a subtraction or an intersection. And then your relationship just represents what that object's role is going to be affecting in the mesh object. So you see right now that we've created our Fusion object, it's a little difficult to actually make out what it is in the viewport. So we've created a shortcut that kind of simplifies working in Mesh Fusion, and you can get that up here, and we can go down here to Model Fusion. And you see that gets us a nice shading here in the viewport, and we can plainly see all of our objects. and there isn't the shader tree tricks that we used to use previously. Not really tricks, but they were kind of workarounds in order to very easily see our meshes. So you see these objects, since they were all selected, they all have that strip size there, blending them between each other. So now when you want to start adding new meshes to that, we want to start defining roles. So if we take this mesh right here and we wanted to subtract that, then we could go up here and then we could click this button right here. And this is the set mesh role to a subtractive. So you see that has changed this into a wireframe here, making it easy to see now that this sort of pink color on here is a subtraction mesh, but it's not actually subtracting anything from here. And that's where we need to start defining a relationship. So if I select this mesh now and I select that one, we're going to start using these buttons right here. So trim and untrim. So since I've only selected these two meshes, that's going to define the relationship when I click this button. So you can see now it is subtracting only from this barrel shape, but it's not subtracting from the box shape at the same time. Of course, you know, if you wanted to add that and then go into the box, we could also trim from that one as well. Or you could untrim those objects. And like previous versions of Mesh Fusion, of course, these effects are all live in here, so we can make adjustments to our mesh. Now the next sort of role that you can add to a mesh, if you want to add additional meshes to it, is we simply need to select the object and we can click a role. So I'll set this one to intersect, and you see this one gets a different color here. If I deselect that, you can see that it's purple. So we can move this into place here. And I'm going to scale him up and move him down some. So now we've defined its role, but we haven't defined its relationship. So for this particular one, I could select him and then select the box, and then I can set that as a trim. And you see now, since this is an intersection mesh, it's intersecting around that larger box there. But it's not affecting any of the other meshes because I've not defined a relationship between those. Another little time saver that we've also added is the ability to set a mesh role and apply it at the same time. So if I were to take this cylinder here and move him into place, you know, it's not part of the Mesh Fusion, so it's not doing anything yet, but I can select him and select the barrel, and then now I can click these buttons here. So I can set them to subtract, to add, or to intersect automatically. And if I set that to subtract, you see it is automatically already defined this as a subtractive mesh, and it is subtracting it just from this barrel here, all in just one click. Now, of course, we can select meshes, and this button right here removes an object from the Mesh Fusion object altogether. So now this is no longer a contributor to the Mesh Fusion object. So we have covered all of the various roles that we have here, either adding them to the Mesh Fusion or removing them. I've covered what the concept of the Mesh Role and Apply buttons do. And then, as I've already demonstrated, we can trim and untrim meshes. So if I wanted this guy here to affect the cube, I could set that as a trim. Of course, now I would have to move it in order to be able to see that. So let's move just the cylinder here. Modeling a shape like this using traditional methods would be really difficult, but we were able to just breeze through this using Mesh Fusion. So if you need to adjust the density, like you may have needed to do before, in a Mesh Fusion item, instead of being a user channel, it has now been moved here to the bottom. We have the actual mesh properties, sets the mesh density on that, so you can adjust the fusion subdivisions right there. And if you select the fusion object itself, here you can go in and you can change those default strip profile and strip widths. So if I were to change that up to 80 millimeters, you can see that it increases that as the default for those objects. In another video, I'm going to be going over how to individually adjust strip widths as you would in previous versions of Mesh Fusion. But that should be pretty much everything that you need to get going in Mesh Fusion right away and start creating cool stuff. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.